Good morning, everyone. My paper is entitled "The One Object of My Desire, a Freeborn Minister's Quest for an Education in Mid-19th Century North America." I'm Bill Andrews, and I'm very grateful to Dan Fuller for inviting me to participate in this important conference. Today, I want to introduce those who are attending the conference to a figure I expect may not be familiar to many of you. I refer to James Henry McGee, born into nominal freedom in Southern Illinois in 1839. Here's a picture of Reverend McGee. It's his author portrait. This image appears as the frontispiece to McGee's 176-page autobiography, The Night of Affliction and the Morning of Recovery, which he published in Cincinnati at the age of 34. So here's the title page of McGee's book. I'm writing a book now on the 30 autobiographies that African Americans produced and published during the Reconstruction era. Almost half of the Black autobiographies published during this time, that is between 1866 and 1880, came from men and women whose life stories recount full-time or part-time or occasional service to African Americans as preachers or evangelists. McGee shared with many of his contemporaries in Black ministerial autobiography an evangelical mission bolstered by a sense of obligation to both the spiritual and social uplift of African Americans in his charge. But there are at least three features of McGee's story that make it striking and unusual. First, McGee's autobiography is a testament to his extraordinary devotion to personal education, far beyond what he needed or was expected to have obtained to serve the Baptist congregations he pastored in the mid-19th century. Second, his autobiography is important because it's a personal success story that reviews how its author overcame a life-threatening physical disability. Finally, McGee's autobiography is noteworthy because it states his views on the kind of education he felt was most needful for the recently emancipated African American people of the South in the early 1870s. Before the founding of Tuskegee in 1881, both McGee's personal educational pursuits and his philosophy of education for the freed people of the South anticipate later poles of debate over what kind of education was best for leaders of the race. James Henry McGee came from humble origins. His parents had both been enslaved, and they'd started out in freedom as subsistence farmers. McGee had limited opportunities for education, but his parents encouraged his ambitions for schooling. He dedicated himself early in life to the ministry, launching his professional career as a school teacher in his early 20s and as a teacher-pastor in small rural churches in Illinois by 1863. 10 years later, in 1873, his autobiography concludes with an account of McGee's successful appointment to the pastorate of a thriving urban church in Cincinnati, a church with an impressive history and a large congregation of energetic, prosperous African American parishioners. When McGee published The Night of Affliction and the Morning of Recovery, he embodied literally a heartening story of triumph over daunting adversities in which his African American readers could perceive a message of hope for a people seeking spiritual and social recovery from the afflictions of slavery. The night of affliction that overshadowed McGee from his boyhood to his early 20s is unique among the many adversities and obstacles that Reconstruction-era African American autobiographers met along their life paths after emancipation arrived in December of 1865. Most of McGee's preaching contemporaries recalled contending with a variety of psychological, spiritual, and social challenges, ranging from self-doubt, poverty and a lack of education to overwork and resistance from whites or other African Americans. McGee's response to his divine calling led to similar tests of his faith and commitment. But the peculiar threat to his life's mission was rooted in physical suffering. 12 debilitating years of what he termed, quoting here, necrosis or death of the bone, which disabled him and at times caused his family to fear for his survival. McGee traced the source of his misery to an angry neighbor whose name, color, and ethnicity are unspecified in the text. This neighbor, McGee believed, poisoned him as a boy, as well as much of his family's livestock in an act of revenge against the author's father. From 1853 to 1865, McGee's life was one of alternating hope and disappointment as his parents sought homeopathic and later surgical remedies to an affliction that robbed the sickly, often depressed boy of a fulfilling childhood. What upheld McGee was his trust in God and his conviction that, quote, my Heavenly Father had chosen me for a work, the work of preaching, unquote. What sustained the disabled youth through what he called the monotony of doing nothing, as he put it, was his family's devotion and the intellectual and social stimulation of school. Growing up on the prairie near Alton, Illinois, McGee portrayed himself from childhood as having, quote, early imbibed an insatiable desire for knowledge, unquote. Compelled to leave the first school he attended because of objections to interracial schooling from some local whites in Illinois, McGee was fortunate to have parents who looked for alternatives. His painful infirmities often made walking impossible without a cane or a crutch. But when an opportunity to enroll at a high school in Racine, Wisconsin arose, McGee gladly made the arduous trip with his brother. Although one of only 2 blacks enrolled in the school, he remembered being, quote, gladly received and treated very kindly by all the teachers and scholars, unquote. He could spend only a year here. At age 20, determined to earn his own living, McGee relocated to Jerseyville, Illinois, where he assumed the first of a series of teaching positions in rural black schools. Despite success, he could not be content with his own stock of knowledge, and so he found tutors who could help him read Latin and study ancient history. He underwent a risky surgery in St. Louis in the spring of 1863, which his autobiography depicts in graphic detail. The convalescent expressed his gratitude to God for his survival and recuperation by accepting his first pastorate in a rural Baptist church. However, McGee confided to a ministerial mentor, the one object of my desire, and he italicized the one in his autobiography, was education. In particular, the completion of his secondary education, his schooling. Here's the quotation that I'm just mentioning. During the decade preceding the publication of his autobiography, McGee charted a peripatetic course that permitted him to pursue the twin aspirations of his life. A call from the Queen Street Baptist Church in Toronto in the winter of 1865, this is an African-American church in Toronto, opened the doors of the Toronto Grammar School, where McGee studied for 2 years, winning a prize in Latin and embellishing his scholarly credentials in preparation for going to the university. That's what he wanted to do. A major reason for McGee's complimentary recollections of his Toronto years was his realization, here another quotation from his autobiography, his realization that in Canada, the avenues of learning are just as accessible to the Black as to the white man, provided he has the means to sustain himself in the acquirement of that much desired boon, learning. Despite his fondness for Toronto and his progress at the Toronto Grammar School, McGee sailed for London in the spring of 1867. He wrote that he was, quote, exceedingly anxious to enter some theological school where I might prepare myself more efficiently for the work which God had called me to do. Charles H. Spurgeon, a renowned Baptist preacher and head of the Pastors' College in London, had become McGee's ideal. Quote, to see Spurgeon and sit at his feet and learn from him. That was the young pastor's newest ambition. It's not clear from the autobiography why McGee felt so strongly that he needed to enroll in Spurgeon's Pastors' College. The autobiography is amply stocked with statements from mentors and associates as to the appreciation that McGee's congregations and fellow churchmen felt for his sermons and his ministry. Perhaps a lingering need to prove himself, to compensate for his physical disability by demonstrating outstanding intellectual performance, drove the young pastor to seek advanced schooling in white schools in Toronto and London. The Anglophilia that first bloomed in McGee during his weekly visits to Toronto churches primed him for his sojourn in England. His experience in London led him to wholeheartedly, and some might say uncritically, extol England as, quote, the most wealthy as well as the most powerful country in the whole world, unquote. The British Empire boasted, again quoting, missionaries who have done more for the heathen than anyone else. And McGee also enthused, quote, British money has printed and distributed more Bibles than any other Christian country under heaven, unquote. Enthralled by all he saw and heard in London, McGee spent a little over a year at the Pastors' College before a painful recurrence of his old complaint, he called it the affliction of my knee joint, forced him to return to Toronto in August 1868. The restless pastor had hardly reclaimed his pulpit at the Queen Street Baptist Church before requesting a leave of absence to assume a new post in the American South. Principal of the Baptist College, that's a quote from his book, in Nashville, Tennessee. By this time, McGee had become convinced that post-emancipation African Americans needed leaders from their own ranks, particularly preachers and teachers, who had sufficient mental and moral training, as he called it, to shoulder the immense responsibility of educating the race so that, quote, our people can take the helm and thus guide the ship of destiny among our own people, unquote. The young pastor's advocacy of education by and for African Americans appears to have been consonant in some ways with what scholars have called the freedom gospel of spiritual and educational self-determination, advocated by AME and AME Zion missionaries in the Reconstruction South. However, McGee remained at his Nashville post only a year before moving with his new wife, both of them suffering from poor health, back to Alton, Illinois. There, McGee served as both a pastor in the local Baptist church and a teacher in a public school for Black youth. In February 1871, McGee finally gave up his dual preaching and teaching careers to serve as the minister of a large, flourishing Union Baptist church in Cincinnati. The night of affliction and the morning of recovery closes with tributes from the trustees of McGee's Cincinnati congregation who praised his, and here I'm using words that are quoted in the book, high endowments, many personal kindly traits, and numerous ways in which he had enhanced, quote, the material, intellectual, and spiritual welfare of the community he pastored. In the last half of McGee's autobiography, the accumulating testimonials to his demeanor and character, educational attainments, and professional excellence polish the author's self-image to a high gloss. The result is a story of practically unmitigated success, one of the most insistently positive of all the Black autobiographies of the Reconstruction era. The Night of Affliction and the Morning of Recovery touts its subject as a high-achieving young professional, a model of resolute African-American masculinity that promised a sophisticated, progressive leadership for the new post-emancipation era. McGee's account of his strivings for distinction in predominantly white schools so that he could render spiritual and educational service to his Black congregations may have been motivated by a more direct purpose as well. He may have designed his life story to counter racist caricatures of Reconstruction era Black ministers, many of them community leaders as well, who, according to prejudiced whites, had such lax morals and scant education that they had become, at best, clownish religious showmen, at worst, corruptible, time-serving political opportunists. Disclosing no political affiliations or social activism in his autobiography, McGee's was not the voice of a Black man determined to speak out about the most serious secular issues facing African Americans of his day. However, The Night of Affliction and the Morning of Recovery does contain occasional asides in which the author censures white America's worship of, quote, the Baal of slavery, unquote, and white Americans' continuing obeisance to its shadow, prejudice, also, unquote. Recalling a speaking engagement to a large emancipation celebration in St. Louis in the summer of 1865, McGee commended the city's Black population for having risen from abject bondage to what he called partial liberty. Now we'll look at a quotation that I'll read to you here. McGee explained, "I say partial liberty because that is not liberty which denies a part of the citizens of a country rights which others are invited to enjoy." These brief statements attest to McGee's socio-political awareness, but his autobiography does not articulate remedies or routes that African Americans could adopt to address their partial liberties in the 1870s. It was McGee's cordial and judicious ministering, I'm quoting from the book, to his congregants, his effective evangelism, his promotion of the prosperity of the church, that most appealed to the Union Baptist trustees in Cincinnati, whose warm endorsement of their pastor's many achievements in soul-saving and Christian leadership is a prominent part of the last pages of the autobiography. The final scene in the book finds McGee preaching in Louisville, Kentucky in the spring of 1873 at one of the largest churches in the southwestern country, according to McGee. For him, the occasion was something of an emotional homecoming, as Louisville had been his mother's birthplace. In that city, his father had worked to earn the money needed to purchase his mother's freedom and that of her first two children. Before a large African-American Baptist congregation in one of the most beautiful houses of worship among the colored Baptists of that city, McGee wrote, he perceived many hopeful signs attesting to the capacity of our people to be a great blessing to themselves and to the world, unquote. Progress, he concluded, was the watchword and order of the day for both the Black people of Louisville and, by implication, for their favorite son, James Henry McGee. McGee's autobiography covers only the first 34 years of his life, but I wanted to know more about what happened to him after the book came out. So here's what I have learned, at least. Here's a brief outline of it. In 1835, a little more than a year after McGee's autobiography came out, his life took an abrupt downward turn into scandal. In December 1834, the Cincinnati Enquirer, which of course was a large white newspaper in the city, introduced the young pastor to its predominantly white readership with a gleeful charge of gross hypocrisy, namely engaging in adulterous assignations at a, quote, house of ill repute in the city. 6 months after these accusations, Mary Armsby McGee sued her husband for divorce. In June 1875, the trustees of Union Baptist Church fired McGee, officially announcing in the newspaper, quote, "We will say to all churches, congregations, and persons to beware of Elder James McGee, as he is a bold, bad man," unquote. 2 months after this newspaper announcement, which actually spread through the South, McGee left Cincinnati to marry Susan Marshall in Covington, Kentucky. Marshall and McGee had been linked in a sexual affair alleged by the Inquirer. The couple settled in Metropolis, Illinois, where the former pastor earned his living as a teacher. Later, McGee worked as a government clerk and a physician in Chicago. He became an active participant in Illinois Republican politics, serving as a member of the Republican State Central Committee in 1882. James H. McGee died in Springfield, Illinois in 1912, eulogized by the local newspaper as, and here I'm quoting, Dr. J. H. McGee, leader of the colored people of this city, a true, honest, and good churchman, and an elder of the Illinois AME, and here I interject, not Baptist, conference, unquote. As McGee recalled the year he spent as principal of the Baptist College in Nashville in 1864, he inserted his most explicit statement of his philosophy of African American social advancement. And here's a quotation from the book that I will read to you. "What our people most need is mental and moral training, so that preachers and teachers may take positions as the leaders among our own people. None can so effectually do this as the people who understand their own needs and can sympathize with the deficiencies of their suffering brethren. Therefore, let us educate, 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 until our people can take the helm and thus guide the ship of destiny among our own people, until we shall have reached that true eminence to which all true greatness tends, the moral and intellectual development of true manhood and womanhood," unquote. In this statement, McGee endorsed a self-help approach to educational uplift among African Americans as the dark night of slavery was finally ending and the freedom era was dawning. McGee went to the Baptist College in Nashville because it was a school for the training of Black preachers and teachers that had been launched only a couple of years earlier under the leadership of a white Baptist preacher and missionary. But McGee's brief statement of educational philosophy shows that he wanted Black schools like the Baptist College to be led by Black men and women because they could best understand and sympathize with the Black students in their charge. In this regard, McGee subscribed to a crucial feature of Tuskegee and the Little Tuskegees that followed Booker T. Washington's model. McGee's belief in Black higher education by and for the benefit of Black people during the Reconstruction era was not strong enough to induce him to stay at the Baptist College in Nashville. He was not on the staff in 1866 when the college became the Nashville Normal and Theological Institute, supported by the American Baptist Home Mission Society. In 1883, the Nashville Normal and Theological Institute was incorporated as Roger Williams University, named for the founder of the Rhode Island colony and the First Baptist Church in North America. By that time, of course, McGee had moved away to Metropolis, Illinois, and was supporting his family as a teacher. In what sort of school, I don't know. Among all the Black ministers who published their autobiographies between 1866 and 1880, McGee was singularly dedicated to gaining what he called a classical education. The three schools about which he wrote so admiringly, that public school he could attend in Racine, Wisconsin, the Toronto Grammar School, and the Pastors' College in London, were all predominantly white institutions, where McGee's object of study was either preparatory for a university education or In the case of the curriculum at the Pastor's College, what we might call today a liberal arts course of study. His courses in London included, I'm quoting again from the book, modern and ancient history, geography, natural science, Greek and Latin, with an occasional lesson in Hebrew, unquote. This, of course, was definitely not the kind of curriculum that Tuskegee or the Little Tuskegees offered. The curriculum McGee wanted was much closer to what W.E.B. Du Bois championed in Of the Wings of Atalanta in The Souls of Black Folk. In that book, which was published 3 decades after McGee's autobiography, Du Bois pictured Atlanta and Fisk and Howard universities as, quote, green oases of knowledge in the South, where, quote, again, missionaries of culture would be trained and dispatched to elevate the race in ideals, broad, pure, and aspiring, end quote. These sentiments of Du Bois were very much in keeping with the kind of education McGee pursued so diligently. James Henry McGee's life and autobiography represent, therefore, a confluence of ideas about education in 1873 that by the turn of the 20th century would be viewed as conflicting programs. In his own quest for an education that would satisfy his intellectual aspirations, McGee allied himself firmly to the cultural values of the classic liberal arts education of a Howard or Atlanta university. But when he had the opportunity to teach in a college, he chose a Black training school in Nashville that emphasized practical preparation for specific careers designed to uplift Black Southern communities. McGee's belief that such schools should be led by African Americans also anticipated the educational self-help and racial solidarity philosophy of the Tuskegee movement. Had McGee's career not been derailed by scandal, who knows how this man might have influenced or even ameliorated the eventual polarization of the educational philosophies and practices of W.E.B. Du Bois on the one hand and Booker T. Washington on the other. Thank you for your attention.